So, here we go. Once again, welcome back to the lectures. So, dire-diretso na tayo. This is now the endocrine system. So, unang-una, ano bang nangyari sa akin kahapon? Well, what happened was, I I had a patient who was undergoing dialysis, or rather, hindi pala, about to undergo dialysis. So, nasa lobby siya. And then, what happened? Kausap siya, medyo mahina, no? Very weak. And then all of a sudden, or rather like maybe in a few minutes, what happened was bigla siyang nawalan ng malay. Okay, biglang nawalan ng malay. So, syempre, yung mga nurses, yung mga nursing aides, yung mga maintenance na crew natin na tumutulong din sila, no? Very important. Sila yung mga may mga lalaking katawan, no? Bubuhat ng mga pasyente, mga ganon. So, ang nangyari was siyempre yung watcher na siyempre nabaliw, no? Nabaliw kasi hindi siya sanay ng mga gano'n. So, anong nangyari? Nung dinala siya sa loob or rather nung pinaupo siya kasi we have like a chair na parang yung tipong pwede kang humiga, okay? Parang sofa siya, no? But it's a parang ano, parang siyang lazy boy, I think. Was it a lazy boy? Oo, basta parang gano'n. So, pinahiga namin parang recliner, gano'n. Tapos chineck namin 'no, ang unang-unang napansin ko ayaw nga magising 'no, kahit kurutin mo 'no. Of course, as an oversimplification. There is a proper way na kurutin ng isang tao para magising 'no, or para malaman mo kung responsive ba siya or not. So when we did that, ayaw, 'di ba? So the principle there is tried to apply pain as a stimulus para magising, pero hindi. Okay, hindi siya nagising. Ano pa? Humihinga naman siya, but when we check, na-realize namin na na yung skin niya malamig, no? Ibig sabihin, pinapawisan din siya, pero malamig. So what did we do? Although at the time, alam ko na possibly ano ang nangyayari because we can never be too sure, 'di ba? But clinically, I had an idea what was happening. Okay? So ang ginawa ko, I told the team na to check the blood glucose or the blood sugar. So ang ginawa ni nurse, kumuha siya, tapos apply the nursing interventions, tapos kumuha siya ng dugo, patak lang naman 'yun, no? That was the painful. Actually painful siya pero sobrang liit lang naman, pero masakit, no? Pa So 'yun, kumuha ng blood glucose sa fingertip area and then chinek namin. It was actually 30 milligrams per deciliter or was it 31? No? Parang ganon. Now, this is significant because the normal is depende kung anong libro mo. There's going to be a book that's going to say 70 to 110 milligrams per deciliter. Meron ding magsasabi 80 to 120 milligrams per deciliter. Now, ang importante dito is that they all agree na once nag-below 60 milligrams per deciliter, that is already hypoglycemia. Now, the patient had 30 or 31, which is almost or roughly half of 60. So talagang mababa. So that confirmed my impression or kumbaga my initial diagnosis. Okay? So ang ginawa namin is we gave the 50 ml sugar. Okay? That's just sugar, glucose. And then, so in-inject namin. Tapos what happened was after 1, 2 minutes, tumaas. And parang milagro, nagising at ang sinabi pa, asa pwede mangihi. Ganon kasimple. Okay? That is what is so nice and interesting about the endocrine system. So we're going to talk about that also later. Okay, so let's begin. Ayan. So what are the components or how does the endocrine system work? Well, it functions using a second messenger system of the body. Ano bang ibig sabihin ng second messenger system? Ibig sabihin lang nito is that merong intracellular signals. Ibig sabihin, may mga signal na ginagamit sa loob ng cell. Kasi nga, yung signal na ito, itong mga hormones na ito, ay galing sa labas. Okay, it comes from outside the cell. So what happens is that it will trigger a process inside the cell to affect what it wants to change. Okay? So ito yung tinatawag natin na hormones, itong chemical messages that are released into the blood. Okay, now let me tell you this ngayon pa lang. Hormones are chemical messengers na nanggagaling depende kung nasa malayo or katabi or by the same gland. Okay? So kapag galing siya sa malayo, okay, we call it, 'di ba, endocrine. Kapag naman katabi lang, we call it paracrine. At kapag naman sa sarili niya lang, nag-effect siya sa sarili niya, we call it autocrine. Okay? So more on that later. Now, what about hormones? Hormones control several major processes in the body. In short, without hormones, you're not going to survive. Why? You're not going to survive because what is important? What did you learn in prelim na importante to survive ang katawan? And that is the process of metabolism. Okay? Now, hormones by large are the ones that are responsible for controlling metabolism. So maliban doon, ano pa? Reproduction, growth and development, mobilization of body defenses, ito yung mga white blood cells natin. Tapos maintenance of much of homeostasis. Again, ano yung homeostasis? Ito yung internal environment. Kumbaga, kung sa computers pa or sa mga makina, ito yung tawag nating default. Okay? Ito yung default system natin, yung homeostasis. So what does that mean? It means that hormones are being used by the endocrine system to make sure that we do not deviate from homeostasis or from the default setting. Kasi otherwise, that would be disease. Okay? But let's just say, and another simple example would be this. Kunwari, gising na gising ka, puno ka ng, kumbaga, kumpleto yung tulog mo, you're quite awake. So let's say na that is your default setting, no? Or your default mode in the morning. Kapag maganda yung gising mo, kumpleto yung tulog mo. Now, you took some caffeine. So, ang nangyari, kasi maili ka ng coffee and you had it brewed or yung mga tipong black, no, without mga creamer or sugar, kasi you're like that, you like that. Gusto mo yung konting pait, no? So, let's say, yung alertness mo biglang umakyat. So, you're super alert now. So, ang mangyayari is that the endocrine system is going to try to bring you back to default or normal. Okay? So, ganun na lang yung iisipin natin. Now, overview about hormones. They're produced by specialized cells. Ibig sabihin, hindi siya basta-basta na-produce. So, for example, you have a thyroid hormone. That's what we call it, a thyroid hormone. So, nasaan siya galing? Galing siya sa thyroid. Okay? How about the pancreas? Now, the pancreas is very interesting because it's a combination of many. It has a combination of different functions. Pwede siya sa gastrointestinal, pwede din siya sa endocrine per se. Okay? So, pero pag sinabi mong insulin, which I'm sure familiar kayo, in a way na narinig nyo na siguro, at the very least, insulin, eh, alam nyo ng pancreas dapat nanggaling yun. Sa mga sa mga may medical background yung family, alam nyo na rin na ang insulin ay may, let's say, kapatid or kakambal or let's say counterpart, 'di ba? Ito yung parang kalaban niya, bumabalanse sa kanya. Yun naman ang glucagon. Okay? Glucagon. Now, what else? Cells secrete hormones into the extracellular fluid. So, what is extracellular? Ito yung mga compartment or mga bagay na outside the cell. So, 'di ba, alam natin na ang hormone ay galing sa isang cell. So, since yung cell na yon ay nag-produce ng hormone, ilalabas niya into the extracellular. Kung saan, magta-travel siya or magta-transport na lang, that's a better term, to the distant site or what we call the target area or the target cell. Okay? Kaya ganon. Now, blood transfers hormones to target sites kasi kasama yon sa extracellular, yung intravascular, di ba? Now, these hormones regulate the activity of other cells. And I tell you, even hormones regulate other hormones. Okay? So, tingnan natin. Now, how about the chemistry of hormones? Now, if I'm not mistaken, you are enjoying the very beautiful subject of biochemistry now. So, ano bang pinagkaiba ng proteins, peptides, and amines, no? Madali lang, 'di ba? We can talk about that in the simplest of ways as the levels of organization. So, pwede siyang amine, and then pag dumami, kasi nagkakaroon ng peptide bonds and all that, so nagiging peptide siya. Tapos pag pinahaba mo yung yung peptide or pinarami mo, 'di ba, nagiging polypeptide. At yung protein ay constructed or gawa sa maraming polypeptide. So ganun lang 'yon. Okay? Now what else? We have a steroid. So what is something about this that's important? Lahat ng steroid hormones are galing sa cholesterol. Kaya nga may sterol, steroids. Okay? So, hindi ibig sabihin na kapag may cholesterol, masama sa katawan. Hindi po ganun yon. And let me just say it, karamihan ng mga tao or let's say mga parents natin, no, or maybe mga lolo-lola, kasi you're a lot younger than me, OMG, no? Okay. So, ang mangyayari ganito, malamang naririnig na, ayoko yan kasi ayoko kumain ng ganun kasi mataas yung cholesterol niya, no? Meron din tayong makakakilala na ano ba, ewan ko 'no, ay ano bang difference ng adobo sa humba? I don't know. Basta ang nakikita ko 'no, I mean, I'm not a chef and, kumakain lang ako ng masarap and all that 'no, but 'pag nakita kong humba, talagang sobrang greasy 'no, tas sobrang masabaw na may makakilala tayo, most likely siguro classmates niyo dati or mga relatives niyo na yung humba, yung sabaw niya and all that 'no, ginagawang hindi siya ginagawang sauce, ginagawang sabaw 'no, may mga gano'n talaga. So, ito yung tipo na lumulutang na yung kanin. So, that's high cholesterol. Now, tama bang sabihin na nakakasama ang cholesterol? Yes, tama siya as long as it is in abnormal amounts or super high. Pero what am I trying to tell you? What I want to tell you is that cholesterol is not necessarily bad. It also has its own functions. And nakakatuwang isipin, but actually, ang majority of the Filipinos who are complaining na mataas yung cholesterol nila or yung fat na lang sa kanilang dugo are thinking na galing ito sa taba. When in fact, majority of that comes from carbohydrates. It comes from carbohydrates. At ano yung favorite carbohydrate ni Pilipino? Siyempre, kanin. No? Kanin. Bakit naman nagkaganon? Simple lang. Of course, your carbohydrates, if not used or unused, become stored as fat. So, ganun lang. Okay? Now, prostaglandins are made from highly active lipids naman. So, eto sila yung mga responsible sa mga pain or inflammation. Okay? Sige. Now, how do they affect? Okay, how does it work? Ang mechanisms of hormone action, hormones affect only certain tissues or organs. So, depende, no? Like what we said, di ba? They come from specialized cells and they have a target cell. Now, paano mo nalalaman? Okay, baka nag-isip kayo, no? Na if you're really the very curious or interested type sa mga ganitong bagay, no? Like, if you love biochemistry, papaisip ka, no? Okay. Kunwari, kunwari, we have erythropoietin. So that comes from the kidney. It's produced by the kidney, which stimulates or let's just say triggers the increase of production ng bone marrow of what? Red blood cells. Okay? So si kidney, or actually a very specific portion of the kidney, produces erythropoietin and tells the bone marrow to produce red blood cells. So magtataka ka siguro, paano nalaman ng katawan na para siya sa bone marrow? Or paano nalaman or paano nagkaroon ng parang kung missile pa, no? Paano nagkaroon ng homing beacon, no? Or parang naka-home, naka-lock yung missile na yon, yung hormone na yon sa bone marrow. The mechanism is simple. Yung bone marrow, which in this case is the target cell, meron siyang specific na receptor. Okay? Na anong alam natin sa receptor? It is depende, no? Depende what type of shape siya, which depends on which will rather determine kung saan siya magre-respond. So let's just say na the receptor has a very specific shape kung saan sakto lang na matitrigger siya ni hormone, in this case, erythropoietin. So let me clarify that para madali. Simplify natin, no? Nakikilala ng hormone, or rather, baliktad, no? Nakikilala ni target cell si hormone if it responds or interacts with the very specific receptor. Kaya merong sinatawag na target cell. Now, kapag nag-bind siya doon na magte-trigger si second messenger system at kumbaga i-impluwensyahan niya what happens inside the cell. Okay, what are the effects caused by hormones? Changes in plasma membrane permeability or electrical state. Ito yung tipong ano, no? Kunwari, no, naiihi kayo. So, there is a hormone na magpapaihi. Meron ding hormone na hindi magpapaihi sa'yo. So, what does it have to do with permeability? It's all about reabsorption of water. Okay? At meron din, no? We have an enzyme we call permease, no? So kasama din 'yon. Okay? So sige lang, more on that later. Now, so we talked about hormones also being responsible for the synthesis of proteins such as enzymes. Now, hold that thought. Please remember na pinag-usapan na natin ito. Okay? Na proteins can be flat, which are structural, or globular, which are enzymatic. So are proteins enzymes? Yes and no. It's better to say are enzymes proteins? Yes, but not all proteins are enzymes. Okay. So activation, inactivation of enzymes? Yes. Kasi karamihan, I'm not sure if this is discussed in biochem, but remember na hindi lahat ng enzymes pag nilabas mo sa dugo, no, are already active. They are inactive. Kasi baka pag there is premature inactivation, masisira yung organ. Like for example, you have digestive enzymes from the pancreas. Lalabas siya ng pancreas in general inactive. Okay? Bakit? Because you have to give it time to travel to the intestines. Ganun siya. Okay? Now, what would happen if automatically ma-activate mo yung enzyme sa loob pa lang ng pancreas? What will happen is a very comfortable, or rather very uncomfortable story. This is autoimmune, or rather not autoimmune, but auto-digestion. Ibig sabihin, it will digest itself. Okay? And that will end up as pancreatitis. Now, what is the significance of this sa Pinoy? Simple lang. This is one of the reasons na may mga lalaki na natutulog lang at hindi na nagigising. Okay? One of them is pancreatitis. And that is why, maybe we can talk about it in GI or in the gastrointestinal tract, kung bakit nangyayari yon usually kapag nakainom or nakadrugs ang lalaki. Okay? Now, what else? Hormones are also responsible for growth. That is, ano yun? Sa reproduction, di ba? Sa mitosis. Now, steroid hormone action. Now, there are two ways that hormones can work, and that is steroids or non-steroid na paraan. Okay, now what is it about the steroid hormone? I want you to look at the steroid hormone action muna, and then we're going to look at the non-steroidal hormone action later. But the trick here is that you just have to understand or memorize one. Okay, so that is a very simple but very effective study tip. If you have to memorize two things, or kumbaga dalawang, you have to memorize a table na may dalawang column, just, of course, familiarize both, but memorize only one. Because kung ano yung hindi mo na-memorize, then definitely yung isa na yon. Okay? Sige, so here we go. What about steroid hormones? They diffuse through plasma membrane of target cells and they enter the nucleus. In short, para silang ghost na pumapasok. Or if you're a fan of the Marvel Avengers, para siyang si Vision, no? Lulusot lang here and there, no? Lulusot siya sa cell. And then when it enters the nucleus, it binds to a specific protein within the nucleus, and then it will bind to a specific site on the DNA kung saan mag-activate or inactivate siya ng genes that result in the synthesis of new proteins. Kung inactivate naman, it will tell that to stop, 'di ba? Kasi nga homeostasis. Now, here's how it looks like. Look at the steroid hormone. I am assuming you can see my pointer or my cursor. So, ito na parang si Vision na pumapasok lang dahil kaya niya lang, diretso lang. Pasok siya ng cytoplasm and into the nucleus. The receptor protein is going to tell that protein na okay, patingin ng DNA, then you uncoil, then eto, I'm going to exert my effect, and then lalabas ngayon yung new instructions into mRNA, and then lalabas siya, if a fold into a new protein, and then ilalabas, no? Unless yung protein na ito will affect this cell mismo. Okay? Kasi 'di ba sabi natin, hormones can tell other hormone producing cells to produce other hormones. Okay? So, ano itong hormone receptor complex? That's a very fancy term for what essentially means nag-combine lang siya. Okay? Nag-combine lang si hormone and receptor pag complex. Now, if you're into this, eto naman ang bumalik bumalik no. Now, here's the other one if you're into this. Eto na lang memorizein mo. So, kapag hindi siya steroid or non-steroidal, kailangan muna niyang dumaan sa isang membrane receptor. Okay? At doon siya parang nagpapaalam, no? Para pumunta ka ng mall and then sinabi sa'yo na, "Oh, kailangan mo ng face mask." "Oh, naka-face mask naman ako, sir." "Oh, sabi mo sa security guard." Sabi. Tapos ang gagawin niya, itatapik niya yung ano, yung announcement, no, or yung naka-post sa gilid na kailangan ng ano, face shield. Okay? So dahil hindi siya pumayag, hindi ka makakapasok. So anong gagawin mo? Paano yung kakita mo sa loob ng mall or yung ka-meetup mo? 'Di ba? Ano sasabihin mo? Sir, ganito na lang, pwede bang ikaw na lang magsabi sa kasama ko, eto itsura niya, eto yung suot niya, eto naman yung message ko, pakisabi naman kasi hindi ako makakapasok. So it's the same thing. The hormone itself does not enter the cell. So what happens is that you tell the security guard na, hey, ito yung itsura niya, ikaw mismo ang pupunta doon kasi you're not gonna let me in. Kasi nga, I don't have a face shield. So in this case, it's going to set off a series of reactions that activates an enzyme. And that enzyme will catalyze a reaction. Bakit? Ano bang enzyme? Again, we talked about this before, but let me just clarify. Focusing again on biochemistry. An enzyme is not essential for survival. Okay, in a way, in theory. Why? Because it only makes it easier for cellular processes to get activated faster. Okay? So, ibig sabihin, whether or not may enzyme, mangyayari pa rin yung mga processes ng enzymes. It's just that sobrang bagal talaga. Okay? And that's why we need these enzymes to catalyze a reaction or to trigger a reaction to produce the second messenger molecule. And it oversees additional intracellular changes to promote that response na kailangan mo. So, eto ka, si first messenger, okay, may mask ka, walang face shield, try ka paalam kay kay security guard. Okay, tapos hindi pwede kasi wala kang face shield. So sabi mo, o sir, ikaw na lang, tawagin mo na lang yung friend ko or yung kabitap ko or pinsan ko, gano'n, no? Okay, kasi kunwari wala kang cellphone, no, or empty bat ka. Sige. So si security guard, ginawa mo or magraradyo siya ng ibang tao, no? Ginawa mo siyang second messenger. Okay? To effect the needed change na gusto mo to produce that specific response. Like what? Cellular function, like glycogen breakdown or glycogen production. Okay? Remember yung anabolism and catabolism. Okay. Now, let's talk about how hormones are released. Now, they are maintained by negative feedback. In short, napakasimple lang, no? Again, if actually, I think napag-usapan na natin to, no? So, but if not, edi remember na lang natin na the goal is always to go back to normal or default. Okay? So, kunwari, sumobra ka sa isang sumobra kang kumain, so ang mangyayari is magte-trigger yung katawan mo ng signal na, uy, sobra ka na, sobra na, hindi ka na lugi sa buffet, no? Sobra na yung kinain mo sa presyo, luging-lugi na yung restaurant sa'yo. So, syempre, ikaw, pipigil ka. Okay, that is negative feedback, which, by the way, encompasses a lot or a majority of the cellular processes in the body. Now, what is positive feedback? Now, the best example for positive feedback is that pag nasugat ka. Okay? Pag nasugat ka, it will tell your blood to clot. Otherwise, you're going to be bleeding to death, and that is not a good way to go. Okay? Not that there's any good way to go, but the body will tell your blood to clot even more. So that will be positive feedback. Ibig sabihin is going to support the process. Now, what else? A stimulus or low hormone levels in the blood triggers the release of more hormones. So we're going to talk about that later. The hormone release stops once an appropriate level in the blood is reached. Now, again, it depends on the effect you're trying to produce. So endocrine glands are activated by other hormones. Remember what I said kanina? Napag-usapan natin na hormones can actually tell other cells to produce other hormones. Okay, so for example, we have actually, no, we call it the HPA, the hypothalamic or hypothalamus pituitary axis. So here we go. Number one, the hypothalamus secretes hormones. Oh, by the way, no, I just wanted to say this. Kita niyo ito? This is the pituitary gland. Okay? O, sige, yung iba, no, yung ibang tinuturo sa amin, no, like yung isang prof ko, no, pituitary gland. Oh, fine, pituitary. Pero ako talaga pituitary, bahala na, no? We used to call the pituitary gland as the master gland kasi we thought na, hey, wow, it controls a huge number of cellular processes in the body. So parang it has to be really the master. But then, we discovered recently, now I can't say when, but relatively recently, we have stopped calling the pituitary gland as the master gland. Okay? Bakit? Kasi na-realize namin or rather na-realize ng mga scientists, no, na nasa libro pala talaga, so when they published it, na hindi lang pala ang pituitary gland ang origin ng ibang hormones. Ang iba pala ay galing sa hypothalamus. Okay? Yung iba pala ay galing sa hypothalamus. Lalo na, etong kita nyo ito, no? This is the anterior, by the way, the anterior, and this is the posterior. So some of the hormones are from the hypothalamus. This is part of the brain, ha? Part of the brain ito. And then, bumababa lang siya for storage and release sa posterior pituitary gland. Now, one thing I want you to notice is that, ano ba ang similarity, according to this drawing, ano bang similarity ng hypothalamus sa posterior versus anterior? Okay? Now, if you notice, magkapareho ang kulay ng hypothalamus at ng posterior. Bakit? Okay, simple lang yan. I'm going to tell you that this is the anterior pituitary gland and the other name for this is, if you're gonna go kung yung mga medtech friends natin, no? Or yung mga gusto mag-medicine dyan, we call it the adeno hypophysis. Hypophysis. Let me just write that down. Okay. We call it the, nasa na yun? There you go. We call it the adenohypophysis. Bakit hypophysis? Kasi hypothalamus, okay? Adenohypophysis ang, ano nyo ang anterior. Now, how about the posterior? Now, I wish I could say na may ganito tayo, no? But the posterior is really different, no? Posterior, pituitary gland. Kita nyo, no? Pareho sila ng kulay. So, we call that neurohypophysis. Why? Simple lang kasi gawa siya sa neurons. Gawa siya ng nervous system. Okay? So, that is why pareho sila ng kulay. Now, let's go back. The hypothalamus secretes hormones. There you go. Hormones that stimulate the anterior pituitary gland to secrete hormones that will affect the thyroid gland, affect the adrenal cortex, and affect the gonads. Okay, like your testes or your ovaries. Okay, whichever you have. Now, that is why this was used to be called the master gland kasi it will tell other hormone secretors, no, term ko na lang yun, to secrete more hormones. What else? Changing blood levels of certain ions stimulate hormone release. Let me just read this first. Capillary blood contains low concentration of calcium, which stimulates capillary, no, ito yung level, low blood, stimulates the secretion of parathyroid hormone by parathyroid gland. Okay. So, etong importante dito. This is the thyroid gland. And actually, no, let me change that into a ball pen. Okay. So, ang importante, no, andito yung anterior. Ha? Ito yung anterior. So, ito lahat nasa likod ito. You're looking at, kumbaga, behind the neck. Ito yung posterior. Nasa posterior, may apat. Okay? May apat na gland. And these are what we call the parathyroid glands. So, ilan ang parathyroid gland natin? Apat. Okay? Or baka, kung kunwari, no, baka magtanong ako, how many parathyroid glands do we have? O baka ang sagot, 2 pairs. Depende ha, depende sa itatanong ko. Okay. Now, hindi naman ito never, no? I really doubt itatanong ito sa board exam ninyo, but I do want you to know na may tanong kasi doon sa board exam namin, na nasa libro naman siya. How many parathyroid glands are necessary for survival? The answer is 3.5. 3.5. If hindi mo kaya, if kunwari, no, yung isa nito, no, nahati mo for some reason, operahan, tinanggal, no, nasira ito, buhay ka pa ba? Yes, you can still survive. Okay? If not, wala na ito, then you need to take supplements. Okay? So here we go. Now, I want to talk about calcium ng konti. So what is calcium? No, calcium is what? It is a cation. Okay, calcium. The normal niya is 4.5 to, dito lalabas sa exam ha, pag third year nyo ito, millimol. Or, sa atin pa, 9 to 11 milligram per deciliter. Why did I say this? This is very important if you want to understand the two hormones that are responsible for this. Okay? So, tingnan natin yung next slide. So, just remember, 4.5 to 5.5 mol and 9 to 11 milligrams per deciliter. Next slide. Wala dito. Okay, so let's discuss it na lang muna. Okay? So, ganito yan. Ang magkalaban, okay, anong sinestimulate natin? It's calcium, saan? In the blood. Anong normal value nga niya dapat? 4.5 to 5.5 millimol or 9 to 11 milligrams per deciliter. Ngayon, there are two hormones that are important here. Okay? Ano sinabi dito na isa? Parathyroid gland. So, si parathyroid gland, anong hormone ang meron siya? Nako, ang hirap, no? Ang hirap ng hormone name na ito. Kaya nyo kaya ma-memorize? Parathyroid hormone. Kaya ba? Kaya memorize? Okay, pumalpak yung ano, no? Yung sulat ko. Anyway, there you go. Parathyroid hormone. Now, if you read biochem a lot, this could be another name. This is parathormone. Bottom line, parathyroid hormone, iisa lang yan. Anong importante kalaban niya? Galing naman kay thyroid gland. Okay, it is calcitonin. Calcitonin. Kanino siya galing? Kay thyroid gland. Okay. How does it affect calcium? Simple lang. Okay. Ang gusto ko malaman nyo, eto si parathyroid. Ang tagal ko nang hindi nagsulat ng gamit to, grabe, no? Pangit na nga yung sulat kamay ko, pumangit pa lalo. Naku po, no? Ay, nako. Anyway, I realized, no, bago ko lang na, ano, na-realize na bakit pangit ang kamay ng, sulat kamay ng doktor, no? Kasi namamadali, yun ang dason. Do, meron talagang ubod ng hindi mo maintindihan, no? Pero eto, kasi namamadali. Okay. So, ang importante kay parathyroid hormone when it comes to calcium is that, eto ha, term natin to, sikreto natin to, siya ay patapon. Tapon ng tapon ng tapon ng calcium. Okay? Habang eto naman si calcitonin, nagaling kay thyroid gland, okay? Masyado siyang conservative. Okay. Ano ibig sabihin nun? Okay. Ganito lang yon. Kunwari, eto si dugo, no? Eto si calcium. Ito si calcium. Ang mangyayari niyan, kapag si calcitonin ang makakita sa kanya, kukunin niya, no? Kukunin niya ang calcium. Kasi nga napaka-conservative niya. Bakit? Kasi pag hindi mo kukunin yung calcium na yan, ang mangyayari is malalabas siya ng katawan. Maiihi siya or magagamit lang siya ng skeletal muscles or anything for muscle contractility or anything like that. Okay? Now, how about this? Si parathyroid hormone, ito yung, kumbaga, yung muscle, no? Or kung saan mang parte. Or rather, para mas accurate talaga, no? Kasi you can have calcium in a lot of places. You can even have it in blood vessels. No, we call that mga calcification, which is not good. Okay, kasi titigas yung blood vessels nyo. Anyway, nasan ba ang calcium? Now, it's going to be in the mostly nasa bones and teeth. Okay. So pag nakita niya na nawala, no? So kumbaga, natin to. Kumbaga, kinuha, no? Kumbaga, kinuha. Yung calcium, kumbaga, konti na lang kasi karamihan kinuha ni calcitonin. Magrereklamo naman si parathyroid kasi bakit? Siya ay patapon. So, pawaldas talaga, no? Waldas ng waldas. So, kukunin niya si calcium from the bones. So far, hindi naman ata sa teeth, no? Mostly sa bones kasi karamihan naman nasa bone. And then, ilalagay niya si calcium dito. Okay? So, tapon siya ng tapon ng calcium. Now, what is the problem here? The problem is, in order to get calcium from the bones, kailangan mong wasakin. Okay? You have to destroy the bone matrix. So kaya, pag masyadong mataas, take note of this ha, lalo na pag nag-third year kayo or kung may mga nakilala kayo na may weakness ng bones. Kapag masyadong mataas si parathyroid hormone, nasisira si bones. Bakit? Kasi kinukuha niya si calcium into the blood. Okay? Ganon din. Kapag naman, kailangan natin ng strong and healthy bones, kailangan medyo mataas si calcitonin. Pero ibig sabihin din nun, kailangan meron tayong maraming calcium. Kasi aanhin natin si calcitonin kung wala namang calcium sa dugo, di ba? So, ganun lang importante yon. So, again, let me remind you na, kumbaga, ganito na lang, no? Para simple. Dito si parathyroid. Pag nag-below ng 4.5 or ng 9, or let's just say the term is, this is third year stuff ha, but we're gonna call it hypocalcemia. Okay? Mababa yung calcium. Pag may hypocalcemia, mag-activate si parathyroid hormone, wasakin yung bones to get the calcium para from below magiging normal. Okay? Andito naman si calcitonin. Okay? Kapag sumobra, dumami yung calcium mo, kukunin niya, and isa-store niya sa bone and teeth. Okay? Para naman, from masyadong mataas, it's gonna go back to normal. So, yun yung kwento ng relationship nila. Para silang love-hate relationship. Okay? So, next. Now, nerve impulses stimulate hormone release. So, most are under control of the sympathetic nervous system. Do you remember yung sabi ko na merong kapitbahay ako na nasunog yung kanilang karinderya na may videokehan, no? It happened, God forbid, no? It happened, I think, last year. So, yung kwento ko nga, napauwi ako ng galing duty, tapos nakita ko may sunog, and then ayun 'no, nakakasiraan na ng ulo yung mga ibang tao 'no, nagbabaliwan na siyempre 'no, dahil sa crisis. So people are really, scampering to get their stuff. So yun, sabi ko nga 'no, yung bantay or yung may-ari na siya rin ang bantay, eh, for some reason kay liit din ng babae na normally hindi niya kayang mabuhat yon, eh, nabuhat niya yung ref nilang actually may laman pala 'no. So that was an amazing thing to see, and that was because of nerve stimulation of the endocrine glands 'no. Eto dito pumapasok yung catecholamines na natin 'no. Kita niyo 'to? Number two. So, ba't tayo gumalaw? Okay. Ayan 'no, tigas ng ulo ni mouse ko. Okay. We're going to talk about this, so don't worry about preganglionic. Basta pre means before and ganglion is a group of cells. Stimulates the adrenal medulla to secrete catecholamines. Ito na yung mga adrenaline, mga ganon. So, adrenaline is the reason kung bakit nabuhat niya yun, kahit normally hindi. So, here are the major organs natin. And napapag-usapan natin sila one by one eventually. Yung iba napag-usapan na natin. The pineal gland, ito yung pampatulog sa'yo, no? Pineal gland. Hypothalamus, we talked about that. Okay? Pituitary gland, yung HPA axis, di ba? HPA axis or HP axis, hypothalamic pituitary axis na merong adeno, merong anterior, merong posterior, and ito yung neurohypophysis. Ito si thyroid gland kung saan nasa likod niya, baliktad to guys ha, nasa likod dapat to, na nasa likod niya si parathyroid. No? Kaya nakalagay dorsal, di ba? Don't forget, ha? Don't forget. I hope you have not forgotten. But sa mga nakalimot, no, allow me to refresh you, please. Okay? Na whenever you say dorsal, it is, okay, posterior aspect. Okay. So, back to our show. Okay. So, thymus, it actually secretes thymosin, which is very important nung bata ka pa. Okay? Lalo na yung okay? Pero minsan, nagkakaroon tayo ng problems dito, nagkakaroon ng hormone, hindi pala hormone, nagkakaroon ng tumor. So, delikado din yon. Okay? Now, adrenal glands, ito yon. So, what are these? Ito yung kidney, no? Ito yung kidney. And this is not true, hindi sila magkatabi per se, no? Magkaano sila, no? I mean, yeah, they're very near, but hindi ganito yung placement talaga. Okay. The adrenal glands are the ones on top. So please be reminded na ano nga yung direction natin sa anatomy kapag superior or nasa taas. Okay? Or rather mali, no? Kapag nasa taas is superior. Okay? That is why another term, okay, let me just write it down. Another term for the adrenal, another term is the suprarenal glands. Okay. So another way of saying supra is at least in the anatomy language. So adrenal means on top of the renal system. So ito yung glands sa taas ng kidney. You have the pancreas, then you have the ovaries for the female and testes for male. Now let's talk about the pituitary gland, no, or the pituitary gland. So it's the size of a grape and Grabe no, wag nang magtanong, no? Wag nang mag-isip, no? Kung seedless pa o hindi, no? Okay. It hangs by a stalk from the hypothalamus. Now, remember nyo kanina, di ba? Para siyang, ano, no? Talagang parang stalk lang. Okay? So, sa mga hindi nakaano, sa mga nakalimot kanina, so, nasa na yun? Okay, remember kanina na, kunwari, no? Ito yung hypothalamus. Tapos may stalk lang dyan, na same color sila, no? And then ito yung adeno, ito yung neuro, which is the posterior, no? Ayan. So it hangs by a stalk. Actually, yung stalk na yan, hindi yan for display lang, no? Para siyang highway. Okay? It allows the passage, no, of the hormones. So, ito yung two functional lobes na pinag-usapan natin. You have the anterior and the posterior. Yung anterior, ano nga yung term natin ulit? Adenohypophysis, which is composed of glandular tissue. Gland. Ito si posterior, which is the neurohypophysis. So, ito ay composed of nervous tissue. So, let me just say that again, no? Nervous tissue is the neurohypophysis. Kayo lang may alam niyan. Okay, next. Now, marami hormone ang anterior pituitary or the adenohypophysis. But as early as now, I want you to do it this way instead, no? Ayokong mahirapan kayo. Gusto kong memorizein nyo lang ang dapat memorizein. And what is that? Here's the tip. Memorize the hormones of the posterior. Okay? Memorize the hormones of the posterior. Now, if I could give you a rule, okay, na paano mo malalaman na alin ang anterior, alin ang posterior? Now, generally, but not all, generally, pag anterior, may letter H. Okay? Generally, pag anterior, may letter H. Pero yung isa kasi, no, yung isa kasi sa posterior may H din. That's why I'm saying generally lang. Now, well, anyway, there are 6. So, to affect non-endocrine targets, for stimulate other endocrine glands, they're called tropic hormones, meaning, pag sinabi mong tropic, okay, ibig sabihin, attached sila. Or rather, kumbaga, may affinity sila. Yung affinity para may kagustuhan, may specific na target doon. Okay? So what are the characteristics of all anterior pituitary hormones? They're all proteins or peptides. They act to the second messenger systems, are regulated by stimuli, mostly negative feedback. Okay? Now, eto yun sila, no? Ano sabi ko? Generally, my letter H. Look, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Bakit? Isa lang ang walang H. Etong prolactin. Okay? Prolactin. So, si hypothalamus magsisecrete into the anterior pituitary and lalabas si growth hormone for growth of the muscles and the bones. Yeah, prolactin, no? Prolactin for the mammary glands. Tapos, follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone for the testes or ovaries. You have thyrotropic hormone or, paguhin natin, thyroid-stimulating hormone. That's another term. Thyroid-stimulating hormone will affect the thyroid. And then, meron din tayong adrenocorticotropic hormone for the adrenal cortex. Now, take a look at the growth hormone. Generally, metabolic siya. Its major effects are low and behold, no? Wow, grabe, no? Nakaka-surprise talaga, no? That's so amazing. Growth of skeletal muscles and long bones. So, kaya pala growth hormone kasi growth of skeletal muscles and long bones. Now, it causes amino acids to be built into proteins because biochem will tell you na amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. Actually, peptides and then proteins, no? Okay. It also causes fat to be broken down as a source of energy because you need that to direct cellular activity. Now, functions of the other hormones, prolactin, it will stimulate and maintain milk production following childbirth. Function in males is unknown. So, meron ba tayong prolactin, mga lalaki? The answer is yes. It's just that we just don't know it yet kung para saan siya. May ano ba? Meron ba siyang function? Most likely yes. Ang sabi, Please take note, ang sinabi, function in males is unknown. Hindi sinabi no function. Okay? There is a huge difference between that. Okay. So, ano pang importante? Please take note, ha, na ang prolactin will only make milk. Gagawa lang siya ng milk, pero hindi ito responsible pa para lumabas or sa paglabas ng gatas. Ibang hormone yon. Okay? So, remember, prolactin will make milk. Okay? Kaya nga lactate, 'di ba? Lactation. Okay? Prolactin. Okay. Adrenocorticotropic hormone regulates endocrine activity of the adrenal cortex, kaya corticotropic. Okay? Bakit? Kasi meron kasing adrenal cortex, okay? Meron ding medulla. I believe na pag-usapan na natin last time yan na kapag cortex nasa labas, medulla medyo no, nasa middle, nasa loob. Okay. And then, kita nyo, no? Let me just go back one slide. Anong sinabi? Ay, two slides pala. Anong sinabi dito? Thyrotropic hormone. But look at here. Ang sinabi, thyroid stimulating hormone. That's the other name. And lo and behold, it influences the growth and activity of the thyroid. Gonadotropic hormones. This is the classification of the hormones that are responsible for the activities ng ovaries, like follicle development and then sperm development in the testes. So, dalawa, no? Remember, you have the follicle stimulating hormone or FSH. Then you have the luteinizing hormone. Ito magti-trigger ng ovulation. Okay? So, pag ganito kasi yan, kapag nagkaroon ng dominant follicle, magre-rupture yon, no? Sabi ni luteinizing hormone, mag-rupture ka na. So, pag nag-rupture siya, lalabas si egg. Then, pupunta na siya sa, ano, no, sa uterus. Actually, dadaan mo siya ng fallopian tube into the uterus. Okay? Hindi sa vagina, ha? Lalabas yun. Ang layo no, no? So, kailangan uterus. Okay. So, ano mangyayari? Si luteinizing hormone will also tell the follicle, yung pumutok, okay, kung saan nanggaling, kumbaga yung saan pinanggalingan, yung kumbaga no, kung sa Shopee pa, no, ito yung package niya, no, yung box, kung saan galing yung egg cell, no, yung box niya. Yung ruptured follicle will now become the corpus luteum. Okay? Yung corpus luteum. And it will stimulate testosterone production also in males, referred to now as the interstitial cell stimulating hormone. Now, the pituitary-hypothalamus relationship, ito yung pinag-usapan natin kanina, ang hypothalamic pituitary axis. So the release of hormones is controlled by releasing and inhibiting hormones produced by the hypothalamus. So actually, nagbabanggaan lang sila. So hypothalamus produces two hormones that are transported to the neurosecretory cells of the posterior pituitary. So the posterior pituitary is not strictly an endocrine gland, but it does release hormones. So kumbaga, distributor lang siya. Okay? Kumbaga siya yung logistics partner ng Shopee natin at Lazada. Okay? Siya yung nagde-deliver. Okay. So ano yung dalawang yon? 'Di ba sabi ko memorizein niyo na lang 'to? Dalawa lang. Gets oxytocin and the anti-diuretic hormone. Yun lang. Everything else, okay? Everything else anterior pituitary. That is why I said if I were you, just memorize etong dalawang to. Now, what is oxytocin? It stimulates contractions of the uterus during labor. Okay, that's why this is also another example of positive feedback. And then it causes milk ejection. So let me just state that again. What is responsible for making milk or for lactation? It's prolactin. Pero kapag naman nilabas na, we call that now milk ejection. That is oxytocin. Ano naman itong antidiuretic hormone? Now, antidiuretic hormone can inhibit urine production. In large amounts, it also causes vasoconstriction, leading to increased blood pressure. Now, what is important about this? Okay, I want you to know that diuretic comes from the word diuresis, and diuresis means ihi. Okay, yung pag-iihi mo. So, pag sinabi mong antidiuretic, it means anti-ihi. In short, kapag, okay, let me write that down para mas madali para sa iyo. Okay, ito na lang, no? I'm going to make it easier na lang. Okay, so antidiuretic hormone. Ganon, no? Pag mataas, okay, no ihi. Pag mababa, ihi ka. Okay? So, ganito na lang. Si antidiuretic hormone, pag mababa, ihi ka. Pag wala, hindi ka iihi. Okay? Ganon kasimple. Now, what is it for? Si antidiuretic hormone is responsible for making sure na maganda yung blood pressure natin. Okay? Kunwari, for some reason, no, inuubos mo yung isang botelya ng isang galon, no, isang galon ng tubig, no, dahil trip mo lang. So, syempre, si antidiuretic hormone, ang gagawin niya, hindi siya kumbaga hindi siya magpo-produce masyado. Actually meron pero sobrang konti lang. Bakit? Kasi kailangan mong ilabas yung tubig sa katawan mo or else literally you could actually drown. You could drown from that. Okay? Kasi sumobra yung tubig sa katawan mo. Ngayon, what if naman dahil trip mo lang no nag-exam ka the whole day, no? Wala kang ininom na tubig, no? Ihi ka pa ng ihi kasi umihi ka. For example, a day of your exam, so you woke up early, umihi ka, then throughout the day, hindi ka na nakainom ng tubig kasi nag-exam ka or nag-aaral ka. Okay? You were barely eating, no? Kumain ka lang siguro ng, I don't know, candy or something like that. Okay. So, ang mangyayari is, bottom line, dehydrated ka. Kulang na kulang ng tubig yung katawan mo. So, kulang na kulang na nga yung tubig sa katawan mo, ibig sabihin, kulang na kulang din yung tubig sa dugo mo, yung water component niya. So, question, kulang na nga yung tubig, iihi ka pa ba? Of course not. If you want to make sure na okay yung katawan mo, you have to make sure na na-retain yung tubig. Or rather, baguhin ko yung pagkasabi, you have to make sure na hindi ka na mawawalan pa ng tubig na kulang na nga yung katawan mo. And that is why tataas si antidiuretic hormone to make sure na hindi mo iihiin. Now, let me be more specific. Makakaihi ka pa ba kapag may antidiuretic hormone? Oo naman, makakaihi ka pa. Kaso, sobrang concentrated ng ihi mo. Okay? Sobrang yellow na yellow. Bakit? Hindi siya, hindi siya interested doon sa waste products ng ihi mo. ADH does not care about that. It cares about water. Okay? So, aalisin niya yung fluid component ng ihi mo. Kaya, eto na yung time na minsan mapapasabi ka, no, ay masakit yung ihi ko. Ibig sabihin, it is too concentrated kasi or may bato. Okay? So, ano main purpose is to regulate blood pressure. That's why we talked about vasoconstriction leading to increased blood pressure, and the other name is vasopressin. The other name is vasopressin. Now, ibig sabihin, meron bang other name si vasopressin? 'Di ba? 'Yun, antidiuretic hormone. Paano naman si oxytocin? Meron kaya siyang other name? Meron din. Ang tawag natin sa kanya, pitocin. Pitocin. Actually, FYI lang, no? Gusto ko lang malaman, no? Ninyo, kasi biochem, no? Meron tayong another name for this. Neurophysin 1 and Neurophysin 2. Hindi lalabas sa board exam na yan. Nice to know lang. Okay? Sige. Next. Ayan, kita nyo na, no? So, alam nyo na yan. Hypothalamus. Okay? Antidiuretic hormone, kidney tubules. Will tell you na okay, don't waste water guys ha. O, we need water. O, yun ang ginagawa niya. Oxytocin naman for contraction during labor and for milk ejection, paglabas ng gatas. So, if you're, kung kasama mo, no, may kilala kayong nanganak na, or if you have your mom, your auntie, your lola there with you, maybe you can ask, no, how is labor like? And they're going to say, at first, nagsimula siya na parang halos wala. Kala ko sakit lang yung likod ko. And then, biglang biglang ano, nag-i-increase yung intensity, biglang lumalakas, and then yun na, no, maiyak-iyak, di ka na makakagalaw. That's actually labor na. It's because of positive feedback, and we can all blame oxytocin. Okay? Now, dagdag kaalaman, no? Dagdag kaalaman, no? For those na gusto maging obstetrician and gynecologist, or sa mga gusto maging labor and delivery room nurse, no? Pagpalain kayo, no? Kailangan kayo ng mundo, sobra. That is why kapag may mga babaeng hirap mag-labor, or let's just say, no, marami namang cause, pero let's say the cause is insufficient contraction. Or ibig sabihin, kulang yung tinatawag nating power of the labor. Okay? Yung contraction ng muscle during labor is kulang. So what do? We give oxytocin. Okay? We give oxytocin. And that will end our first part of the endocrine system.